Some years back, an African country unexpectedly lost its dictator, which triggered a bloody succession battle between rival factions in the country vying for control. Peace was only restored when the dictator's son defeated the rebels and assumed power. Now, his first act in office was to stuff all the key state appointments with his family and his kinsmen. And his second was to take control of the country's sole economic lifeline, which was an extremely rare metal that could only be mined in that country. By controlling the extraction of this natural resource, he quickly became fabulously wealthy and powerful. Now, if this story sounds like something you vaguely remember, that's because you probably do remember it. The country was called Wakanda, and its fictional story generated over $1.2 billion in box office revenue in 2018 alone. Since opening last weekend, the second installment of this story has generated over $180 million and counting. Now, you may also remember several fragments of this story from the real places across Africa where they have played out, including the Democratic Republic of Congo, Togo, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Nigeria, Central African Republic, South Sudan, Angola, and many other places. In fact, the entire geopolitical story of the typical post-colonial African state is basically that of a never-ending struggle by individuals and factions vying for control over its natural resource exploitation and extraction. This situation is what I call the Wakanda complex. What is the Wakanda complex? I define the Wakanda complex as a state of political and economic consciousness in Africa that places an exclusive and destructive focus on the alleged abundance of mineral wealth under Africa's soil. In the fictional country of Wakanda, vibranium is more important than food. It's more important than clothing. It's more important than shelter. It's even more important than Wakandans themselves. Vibranium is why Wakanda is fabulously rich, unlike the poor neighbors that it's surrounded with. It's what gives Wakandans their technology. It even underpins Wakandan healthcare. In the diplomatic space, the entire purpose of Wakanda's international relations doctrine is to control the global supply of vibranium. In fact, without his special vibranium suits and the vibranium-infused drink that gives him superpowers, the Black Panther is little more than the Black Pussycat. Now, let's picture a modern African state, say Nigeria, for example, and let's compare it to this fictional situation. Like most post-colonial African states, most of Nigeria's economic and diplomatic leverage revolves around a single natural resource, which in this case is oil. I'm sure we've all seen that map of Africa that labels each country with its chief natural resource exports. So you have Nigeria labeled with oil, Cote d'Ivoire labeled with cocoa, Botswana labeled with diamonds, and so on and so forth. And far from recognizing this map as a giant insult, which it is, many within Nigeria's intelligentsia and political class openly identify with the representation of Nigeria and its 200 million people as 38 billion barrels of oil. Since, like the fictional Wakandans, many of us believe that it is the vibranium that gives our country value instead of the other way around. According to this worldview, which some refer to as African resource nationalism, the primary economic value offered by the African continent to the world is the oil, the gold, the bauxite, diamonds, natural gas, the coltan, lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, and other natural resources that are buried under Africa. Never mind the 1.2 billion plus human beings that happen to live on its surface. Now, to highlight how absurd this way of thinking is, remember that the US is now the world's largest oil producer, having overtaken Saudi Arabia in 2018. But no one would ever dream of representing the US and its 320 million plus people on a map using an oil barrel Because obviously, America is infinitely so much more than just oil wells in Texas and New Mexico. To many Nigerians and Africans who suffer from this Wakanda complex, however, it is perfectly normal and even understandable to spend entire lifetimes doing nothing but jostling and fighting for access to a share of this allegedly rich African mining and extraction pie. Now, in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where Wakanda is based, which is obviously not bound by real-world economic rules, a tiny African dictatorship, which isolates itself from its neighbors, has very little interest in global trade or interaction with the outside world, and runs a single commodity, centrally planned autarky economy, can, through some unspecified means, somehow become fabulously wealthy and achieve a very high level of technological development. But of course, out here in the real world, the inescapable reality is that national wealth is not a function of what natural resources may happen to lie under our feet. As any economist worth their salt will tell you, none of these resources, in fact, has any intrinsic value whatsoever. On their own, they are objectively worthless. A diamond is just a hard piece of carbon. Crude oil is just prehistoric underground sludge. The only value whatsoever that these things have is whatever value the industrial economy, which, don't forget, is primarily located outside of Africa, decides to allocate to it. In other words, it is the buyers who get to decide how much to pay for these natural resources and how much they are worth. And there is no amount of resource nationalism that will make buyers act against their own interests, which consequently means that economies dominated by natural resource exploitation will and can only be poor. Moreover, unlike vibranium, which could only be found in Wakanda, Africa's natural resources are neither rare nor particularly exclusive. So Africa has oil, well, sure, but the world's largest oil reserves are actually in Canada and Venezuela. Africa has rare earth minerals like lithium and coltan, absolutely. But the same minerals can also be found plentifully in China and in Australia. Africa has lots of cheap, fertile land, you bet it does. But advances in vertical farming and hydroponics will render even its cheapest agricultural exports obsolete in the century ahead. Several African countries have diamond deposits, correct. But it so happens that a diamond more perfect than anything you can dig out of the ground in Sierra Leone can now be created in a lab. In fact, a recent study by the World Bank, you should be seeing the image on your screen now, has underlined the sheer size of the gap between Africa's perceived resource wealth, according to the African popular imagination, and the actual reality of global resource wealth rankings. And you can see that there's quite a disparity between what you think of as Africa's resource wealth and how wealthy Africa actually is in reality. These results are as damning as they are clear. The continent whose countries see themselves primarily as standalone Wakanda economies clearly has neither the resource wealth nor the resource exclusivity of Wakanda or anything close to it. In fact, the only reason that mining and extraction take place on such a large scale in Africa is because it is significantly cheaper to extract those resources in Africa than anywhere else on the planet. In other words, Africa is effectively on the bottom rung of the global economic ladder, supplying the global industrial economy with cheap primary inputs while possessing no leverage whatsoever except the ability to compete on price. So if Africa persists with this strategy of trying to be a continent full of standalone Wakanda economies instead of pursuing economic and diplomatic integration, so that we can start trading among ourselves and finally get some of that much needed heat and traction into our economies, our outlook will continue to be exactly what it is today, which is somewhere between completely lost and absolutely nowhere. And if you've taken nothing else away from everything that I've said today, let me sum up everything in one simple sentence. Africa's biggest economic factor and its largest economic opportunity is and should always be its 1.2 billion human beings, along with their skills, their ideas, and their productive capacity, not the vibranium buried under Africa's soils. Death to Wakanda.